Again, to see why, consider some of the standard diffusing explanations. Okay? Well, in particular, first of all, we did ask a bank of, for each participant and for each scenario or vignette, a bunch of non-moral questions, like what Casey and Debbie did caused Jack to suffer, and so on. There were no differences between the Westerners and the East Asians, or the Westerners and the Chinese on those questions. Similarly, it's hard to see how either group could be considered impartial or more impartial or less impartial on these kinds of things, since after all these are third-party judgments where it's hard to see that the participants making these judgments are involved or impacted in any direct way. So partiality looks to be a non-starter. Well, what about rationality? Well, it's kind of hard to take seriously the suggestion that one group or the other suffers from significant irrationality, or that 1.2 billion Chinese have corrupt minds, as Miss Anscombe apparently is committed to claiming. All right, so those are our, I told you I was going to tell you about 3 research projects. Those are the projects, the data, I think, all pointing in the direction of the conclusion that moral disagreement is indeed fundamental, or at least much moral disagreement, or some important moral disagreement is fundamental. But I want to turn now to what I conceptualize as the yes but response, because whenever I give this material and have to stop at this point, the first question is always yes but, okay? And the yes but response indicates that those who think there is little or no fundamental moral disagreement haven't been convinced. The skeptics typically focus, appropriately enough, on details of the individual studies, and the kind of detail that most often is focused on is the suggestion that there may be sources of disagreement that haven't been ruled out, most particularly non-moral disagreement that could be lurking in the background here and that could be causing the moral disagreement. Non-moral disagreement that we haven't looked for, just because there are, of course, basically an infinite number of places where that non-moral disagreement might be hiding. Well, what to do? In part, of course, if for any given experiment somebody were to suggest a non-moral disagreement with a sort of strong intuitive plausibility, any given claim like that can be tested. You do it over again and ask the subjects what they think about that particular non-moral claim. But I think the way to advance this debate, so our work, the work I've just told you about, is of course in the Brandt tradition. It attempts to do a sort of philosophically motivated ethnography. But I think there's a limit to how far that can be pushed in resolving the question about fundamental moral disagreement. What I think we need to advance the debate at this point is 2 things. First of all, an empirically supported theory about the psychological mechanisms underlying the acquisition and the utilization of moral norms, and a theory about how those mechanisms might have evolved. So if we can get empirically supported theories on those grounds, and of course if they mesh with the kinds of findings I've just reported to you, I think that adds a very significant additional bit of strength to the claim that there is fundamental moral disagreement on important matters. Well, as it happens, Chandra Sripatta and I have recently published a theory aimed at doing just that. There's the reference. There's a stack of books, which I'll be happy to send. No. But let me point out, however, that the volume is the second of the 3 volumes from the Sheffield Innate Mind project. Third one will be out soon. I guess next time I'll put in an ad for the other Sheffield project because we do hope to get as many people from around Europe as possible involved in the Culture in the Mind project as it unfolds. All right, well, here is the very simple, straightforward, and obviously true model that Sripada and I offer for the mechanisms underlying moral judgment. I'm not going to tell you a lot about that since the details and the evidence for it is developed at great length in the article I just referred you to. The article, by the way, is also available online on my website, so you should buy the book, but you don't have to. All right. So the model claims that moral judgments, those guys, are largely determined by the rules in what Sripada and I call the norm database. And that what's in the norm database is largely determined by the acquisition mechanism, which is, in turn, heavily influenced by the norms that prevail in the social environment that the person is embedded in. So, people who grow up in social environments where different norms prevail will often, according to this model, or if this model is correct, will often make different moral judgments even in ideal circumstances. Core idea here is what this thing is doing is, by and large, absorbing most or all, or absorbing a filtered subset or a slightly distorted or corrected subset of the norms in the environment to which the agent is exposed. People who grow up in environments with importantly different moral norms are going to end up with different norms in there, and that will ultimately lead to different judgments. Okay, well, there's the model. Sripada and I survey a fair amount of, actually quite large amount of evidence, which we maintain at least is consistent with the model. But rather than to try to give you a compressed version of that very long story in the few minutes remaining, what I want to do is to take up a prima facie disquieting feature that the Sripada and Stich model has, and that a number of people have already pointed out. Namely, it seems to suggest that reason or rationality plays at most a very peripheral role in our moral lives. And this isn't, I mean, that people think this about our theory is far from surprising, since our theory has been influenced by a lot of folks, but one of the people it's been influenced most by is the work of John Haidt, which I'll be talking about, I guess, a little bit in the last talk. But John Haidt notoriously thinks that reason is the tail that, well, no, is the dog that's wagged by the tail. I'm not sure how the metaphor gets unpacked. Haidt notoriously thinks that reason plays at most a very minimal ex post facto role in the business of standard moral deliberation. And many people have said, your theory has similar consequences, and that's problematic for a bunch of reasons. Well, what I want to suggest is, in the few remaining minutes, that in fact isn't true about our theory. I'll let Haidt, of course, speak for himself when he gets the chance. But to make the case, I'll rely on the work of Leland Saunders, who's recently published, I guess recently written, hasn't yet been published, a paper where he argues very interestingly and cleverly that it ain't true that, in fact, the Sripada and Stich model actually supports at least one influential account of the use of reason in moral decision-making and moral deliberation. Namely, it supports, indeed it naturally meshes with a psychologized version of Rawlsian reflective equilibrium. So I want to tell you a little bit about this. I have to put in a sort of anticipatory footnote, because in the last talk next week, I'm going to be saying some fairly negative things about Rawlsian reflective equilibrium. So I don't want to be interpreted as endorsing this as a way of making moral judgments, but rather the dialectic here is, well, if you, like many people in the philosophical world, think that Rawlsian reflective equilibrium, when carried out appropriately, gives you rational justification for both moral principles and moral judgments, if you think that's rational justification and that that's a good thing, that's certainly not incompatible with the Sripada and Stich model.